To my knowledge, Lazaris has only mentioned one individual in the history of the material as a chauvinist, and it's Carl Jung, and the quote is, "Jung was an incredible chauvinist." Now, at the time, I hadn't I wasn't familiar with Jung's work, and while I've had lots of peripheral exposure to Jung through quotes in other people, for example, Robert Bly, whose book Iron John I really enjoyed in my teenage years, and also enjoyed more recently, has quoted Jung in various contexts and considers him an amazing genius. So it's interesting that the one individual in the world that I know of from 1,000 or so hours of Lazaris material is Carl Jung. And the question would be, why? I'm now listening to the Red Book on Audible, and I highly recommend it. And if you look at the masculine and feminine split within the cult or culture, and then look at Jung's divergence from that masculine and feminine split. So if we take the general culture, right? We divide into masculine, feminine. We take Jung and divide into masculine, feminine. Dreams. The typical culture pays no attention to dreams. Jung pays attention to dreams. Dreams are in a feminine in a feminine domain. The typical culture majority doesn't keep a diary. Jung keeps a diary, typical culture does not. Most men do not paint. Jung paints. Typical culture doesn't. Then you look at the focus. Jung's focus is on psychology as a science, whereas the typical culture would focus on outer science. Jung is focusing on psychology, and Jung is focusing a lot on orienting himself towards dreams with exploring fantasy and active imagination, building relationships, looking at intuitions. All in all, my impression is that Jung honors the feminine in himself and in the world about 10 times more than average. To dedicate one's life to imagination, to awareness, to honoring the inner world in 1,000 different ways, puts Jung in the top 1% of men in most points in history as being interested in feminine territory and in feminine ways. So where is the evidence that Jung is an incredible chauvinist? In the broadest sense, we all live in an incredibly chauvinistic environment. It's definitely a frustration to me how many women are chauvinistic about their feminine side. Right? It's difficult in the United States to find women who are proud to lead with their feminine side, number one, and who take praise to their feminine side and that have space for it. Spontaneous quality time is one of the most feminine expressions. And typically I do that outside of the United States because the spontaneity is missing. So men and women, myself included, are in an incredibly chauvinistic cult and dogma. And I think Lazaris is also part of that incredibly chauvinistic cult and dogma. If you look at the heart, mind, and body, triangle, traditionally the mind, the thinking, being in your head, is the masculine. Feeling is typically in the feminine, and the body goes both ways. But if you have coming out of the body rather than the mind, you have the earth being more feminine, so you kind of divide that between the two, and then you look at Lazaris, and Lazaris I would put at 95% mental, right? And the relationship with Lazaris, 95% mental. Yes, there is feeling there, but look at this dialogue right here. This is this also is primarily a mental interaction, right? So you look, okay, Lazaris is primarily mental. This system, this process, 7 steps, these words, this. So it's not about somatic embodiment. The greatest trauma release, which I think is the single most important science on the planet today, is the awareness of, healing of PTSD, and integration and release of trauma and PTSD, requires somatic work that Lazaris has never done or gotten very near to doing. Now, I would say the closest Lazaris does is, and this is definitely a bow to the feminine, to viscerally imagine, right? To take the meditations are very feminine, right? But just look at a 3-hour event. You've got 3/4 of it talking, 1/4 is meditation. So you've got a 75% masculine bias there. You've also got, in the split of Lazaris interaction, you could think of a dynamic, embodied conversation. Now, what does that mean? It means dialogue, it means dynamic, it means spontaneous, and it means embodied, right? Let's have sensory experiences together as a group in a circle where the energy flows back and forth within the circle. This might be an archetype for the integrated heart, mind, and body in balance. But Lazaris is in a vertical relationship, sitting above the group. Lazaris is in the focal point. That's going to a point, right? That's another masculine expression. Lazaris is 75% talking, another masculine expression. Lazaris is 95% monologue. And even the dialogue, Lazaris does not say, hey, what do you guys want to talk about? And listen. To listen is feminine. Lazaris says, tell us what you experienced in our meditation that you paid for about this thing for about 3 minutes, and we'll respond to that, and we'll give the microphone to who we would like to give the microphone, not who's really antsy to say something. So Lazaris is controlling who gets the microphone, controlling the time frame, controlling the topic, talking often, the person will usually say something, and then Lazaris will talk 2 or 3 times longer than that person, and then move the microphone along, right? And so control, masculine, spontaneity, feminine, right? So Lazaris is definitely an incredible chauvinist in the sense of leaning everything into the cult river, right? That's the way the cult flows. Lecture, this, that, the other, financial, this and that. You cannot be an active friend of Lazaris without money, right? So that's also, an exchange, that rather than, a spontaneous, heart-flowing dynamic that you might call a friendship or a lover, we're talking about, no, you don't get in unless you show up at this time with this amount of money and this, clothing with this protocol, or you're out, right? So that's pretty structured. And we're going to talk about this. We're not going to take a vote and engage. So, and Lazaris is not painting and listening, to dreams and all of that. So, it's interesting that Lazaris would single out probably the most famous man who has devoted themselves to feminine territory to label an incredible chauvinist without talking about what he means by that. And of course, there's no chance to ask because that would be a feminine dialogue or a balanced dialogue, right? To say, what do you mean by that? And listen and have a back and forth. That's, there you're looking at the synergy of masculine and feminine, right? And so, it's an ironic piece. And in the absence of dialogue, right, where nobody can ask Lazaris about these things because Lazaris chooses not to make any space for those things, this is a space to explore these odd riddles. Now, that is what it is. Lazaris chose as a we who is non-feminine not to come through a we, not to come through a many, but to come through one. That's masculine, either or, right? And he chose to come through a man, like every major spiritual teacher in history, right? If he had to pick one, he could have picked a woman, right? Could have picked a woman. Why not? He could have picked a man and a woman. He could have picked 5 men and 5 women, right? To come through and have more of a dance and a synergy of all that. Why not? Right? The very strong trend is to the mind, to the man, to the vertical, to the point, and to monologue, right? That's the trend. Now, like Jung, Lazaris has focused that masculine structure, a man on a dais, talking to everyone else, dictating who else talks and all that. Lazaris has used that structure, that focus to, like Jung, talk about dreams, talk about energy, talk about archetypes, talk about very feminine topics, right? But Jung is an incredible chauvinist, but Lazaris isn't, right? And so it's an interesting, it's an interesting tension. Now, in closing, as I think about why on earth would Lazaris single out the most introspective, artistic, creative, feminine-oriented man of the 20th century that's playing a big role in psychology, why would he single Jung out to talk about what an incredible chauvinist he was, and not, Joe Blow raping someone, making burgers, not interested in their dreams, not interested in anything but accumulating guns. I mean, why not mention someone that's actually pretty high-ranking in chauvinism? Why single out Jung? And I guess, you could look at the motivation or the template as being why single out Lazaris? Like, there's tons of hypocrites. Like, we're all hypocrites to varying degrees. And so Lazaris is less of a hypocrite than most. Lazaris is more feminine-oriented in a chauvinistic cult than most, right? Lazaris has more sanity around this whole thing than most. You just try talking about any of this with 100 people vaguely interested in these topics, and Lazaris is in the top 1 or 2% sanity statistics for navigating this, right? So Jung is in the top 1% of sanity and the top 1% of being interested in feminine topics and honoring them. And so is Lazaris. So why single out Jung? Perhaps for the same reason that I single out Lazaris. Like, why not talk about my neighbor's chauvinism? I'm not making a YouTube video about that. Well, I think one reason to highlight the faults in the 1% is to, first of all, highlight the reality that nothing is perfect, and it isn't. Jung is no doubt a chauvinist in his ways. I am no doubt a chauvinist in my ways. Most of the women I know are chauvinist in their ways. So what's, we live in a cult that is exonerating and competing to be the most masculine and to win on masculine metrics. So, but that is not always clear, right? It's not clear how chauvinistic feminists are, but you might be blind. And so I think perhaps one reason to single out, whether it's Lazaris or Jung, is to avoid the pitfalls of thinking that anything's perfect, because it isn't, right? Lazaris is not perfect, but that doesn't stop Lazaris from being in the top 1% in a number of areas. Jung is not perfect, and it doesn't stop him from being in the top 1% in his areas. And I think it's also more of a credit to Jung. Like, if you've never been physical and aren't part of the whole play and drama, down here, to go against all of that chauvinism, right? And have to pay rent, right? Jung served in the military while developing his dreams and this and that, the other, because that was the law at the time. If Lazaris had to serve in the military, serve through World War I, have all the horrific nightmares, Jung was dealing with dreams of blood and bloodbaths, etc., for months before the First World War, and nobody's there to explain it to him that, this is about the large tapestry unfolding in Europe. Jung thought maybe he and his family were about to die based on the dreams because he didn't know how to interpret them. So it's relatively easy to come in as a non-physical entity, unencumbered with all the physical logistics and stuff of that nature, and, and be relatively immune to the culture. Much harder so for a human being to be this different than their time. Right? And I suspect that the reason that Lazaris does monologue rather than dialogue, the reason that Lazaris sits on a dais rather than in a circle, that the reason that Lazaris lectures, rather than participating in discussion, that the reason Lazaris chose a man to channel with rather than, is that is a template that's already set up by a chauvinistic cult that is chauvinistic, right? And there is wisdom in the maxim, don't fight too many battles on too many fronts. Don't bring in something new, channeling in a new way, capitalist channeling, and talk about, lots of different things and do it in a completely different way and do it through a woman and do it in a circle and not charge money for it. No, it's just too many stuff. Like, people like to have most things conventional, and then they like to go to a conventional hotel, eat crappy conventional food, take notes in a conventional, unrecycled notebook paper and all that, and then hear about, in that very, very, very narrow context, hear about all kinds of transcendent types of things. And so, I don't think it's constructive to target the top, and in that, that's something that I've checked in with myself around a little bit. Why, quote, pick on Lazaris when you can, tear the government or your neighborhood or local government or any number of people apart easily with just how fragmented and incompetent, so much of our self and world is. Why focus on Lazaris? And, I do, there's a sense of, comedians often have a protocol of poking fun at that which has more power. I mean, comedians rarely single out some single mother who's fat and stupid and has, 5 kids and, is beating up her kids. A comedian rarely singles them out, right? They'll single out a president or a Rumsfeld or something like that to make fun of. And so I think in that sense, it's, if you're going to complain about the chauvinism in a chauvinistic cult, why not pick on someone like Jung, who is far less chauvinistic than the average person and has more rank and prestige than pick on the average Lazaris friend, who's perhaps even more chauvinistic than Jung and doesn't paint and doesn't do anything, of that nature. And, and so why not pick up, right? And I'd say that's also, if you're going to evolve something, if you're going to, because the whole point of criticizing something in the end is to see, can you create something better? Can you, right? And that is, I certainly do not see an easy way to create a better kind of channeling type thing than Lazaris, right? Because sure, you could suggest to Lazaris, why not channel through a woman or 5 people and this and that? But if Lazaris doesn't want to do that, well, and doesn't take suggestions, well, what do you do, right? The material is pretty impeccable. And if Jung wants to be a chauvinist in various ways, and no doubt he is, you can't just say, could you just rewrite your whole life and do it better than you did, right? You did what, presumably the best that you were able to do. Presumably Lazaris is doing the best that they're able to do within the boundaries and contexts that they're working in. But nonetheless, this is kind of a space for me to air out some of the absurdities and insanities that don't have a voice in any other place in a dialogue.